Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Paul Levy, and I very foolishly volunteered to MC this session. I've known some of the people I will be MCing for more than 40 years, and I've never got them to stop talking in that period of time, so I assume I'm going to fail tonight. But what I volunteered to do is I put together probably an 8 to 10 minute PowerPoint just to set the stage, to tell the history or the context in which the history you're going to hear tonight of a highway that did not happen, basically. So I'm going to, for those of you sitting on the edges, you might want to move in a bit to project up here. And those of you who know my addiction to PowerPoint, I'm going to say something very sacrilegious at this point, because to have PowerPoint up this high in the middle of a religious sanctuary, I'll tell you something. So, but let me talk through this relatively quickly and then really set the stage, because the story that we're talking about tonight really began probably 8 to 9 years before I got to Philadelphia. So I wasn't here for this. I came at the tail end of this, but knew a lot about it. So, you know, we've put together a panel of people who I'll be introducing in a moment, who were really part of this effort, who represent very different parts of an effort to stop a highway from being built and really to create the opportunity for so many, many positive things. It's worth remembering, we talk a lot about our colonial history, but Philadelphia was the largest manufacturing city in the 19th century. This was a city with Stetson hats, and we made hundreds of thousands of hats a year here in the city of Philadelphia. I'm blocking my own show? That's terrible. Oh my God. Stepping on myself. Okay. We made Baldwin locomotives, the largest railroad manufacturing plant in North America. It was on the site at Broad and Callow Hill, where today the Enquirer building is standing. And just to give you a sense of how big it is, you can see the Enquirer building, and it stretched all the way back to 18th Street. So the largest railroad manufacturing company in North America, making more railroad cars than any other company in the 19th century. We made Atwater Kent radios in this city. And before we had a casino, we actually refined real sugar at the Sugar House site, so at Jack Frost's site. And as late as 1954, and hang on to this number because you'll see where we are today, we had about 304,000 manufacturing jobs in the city in the mid-1950s. Here on the central waterfront, this was a working waterfront. We exported things that were manufactured, we imported things that are here, and if you look carefully at this photo, it's a little blurred, and it's probably a little messed up. At the bottom street, there is Washington Avenue, and if you count 2 blocks north, you'll see a little white tower standing up. That is Old Sweets Church, in the middle of an industrial and waterfront community. That's Piers 3 and 5. All right, so the waterfront was a working waterfront with railroad cars, with trucks, with a tremendous amount of activity going on. And these were all working class neighborhoods built along the waterfront, built along small factories that were located within this neighborhood, but all adjacent to the port. Ships came in and people walked down there for work each day. So you had longshoremen and people loading and unloading things from ships. And this was a city without major highways. That's Philadelphia in 1930, and you can see how densely built the city was. And then came a trend that affected Boston and New York and Chicago. We had 52% of our jobs were in manufacturing in 1880. Today we're down to about 3%, about 23,000 jobs. So you get a sense of how many manufacturing jobs were lost from this city. And in those 23,000 manufacturing jobs are PhDs working for Dow Chemical. So they're not really old-fashioned manufacturing jobs. Right after World War II, factories were closing, moving out of the city. Trucks were really carrying goods and services. And then came the containerization of cargo. So one of the major functions of the waterfront was moved to new facilities down at the Packer Marine Terminal, and then also up in the far northeast, but that one's now not functioning. And what that meant is that you needed much less labor. And so all the people who used to get their living by walking down the waterfront to load and unload, those jobs essentially were gone. So by the 50s already, the central waterfront was in decline. It was still working, but there were less jobs and less activity. And shortly after that, all the finger piers here became obsolete, they became empty, and we still some of this today of just piers that are completely neglected at this point. Post-World War II, that's the beginning of Levittown, right? And this is opening day in Levittown in 1953, where everybody left Philadelphia, drove in their car, and bought a house in Levittown. Right? So you had this whole process of suburbanization going on at the same time as manufacturing was declining. And so you got this significant new supply of suburban houses, and that's Kensington, okay? There were 110,000 garment industry jobs along the American Street corridor in 1920. There are none there today. And so you saw these neighborhoods go into severe decline. That's a sort of profile of the city's population peaking at 2.1 million, the suburbs growing, and until recently the city was in decline. We've turned that around at this point. But in the 1950s, the solution was urban renewal. It was, okay, we got to get rid of all the old manufacturing, clear it out, and open the way for new things. And some of that was good, and some of that was incredibly destructive. Urban renewal in Philadelphia began on Dock Street, the little curved street that is right at the foot of Society Hill Towers today. This is where the old food distribution center is. Food would come in off the ships, be loaded into various carriages, and it was moved out to local stores. So this was the importing center for food within the city. By the 40s and 50s, it was getting ever more crowded, more obsolete. By the 50s, all the stories are about rats and stink and terrible conditions and no one wanting to go there. And that is where the decision came to move it down to the new food distribution center, which we still have, immediately behind the Packer Marine Terminal. So we moved it into, at that time, modern facilities. That's Richardson Dilworth in 1956, 1957, supervising the demolition of properties on Dock Street. That's where renewal began. And the first step looked like this. That's the clearance, and those are the footprints for Society Hill Towers, just to put that into perspective. And at the time, it was we needed to do something new, something modern, and so the towers emerged in the 60s along that site, which had been the food distribution center. And then positive and negative. Lots of cities just demolished everything. Philadelphia started early with preservation, but it was a very selective concept of preservation. Literally, if it was colonial and federal, it was good. If it was Victorian, anything else, it had to go. And so you look at the demolition that went on, and you had some buildings knocked down, some saved. But on one level, it was positive in that we were one of the first cities to be doing this type of preservation. On the other hand, people got notices, either fix up your house historically or you need to leave. So there was pressure that moved people out at the same time as it produced some very, very positive restoration of housing within the city. Over on the west side of town in 53, that's the same view from City Hall, where the elevated train tracks were knocked down. And this really gave us the modern office district. So all the new office buildings begin to emerge west of City Hall, and renewal facilitates the huge growth of healthcare, of education. So if you look at Philadelphia today, 42% of all jobs in the city are in Center City, 11% are in University City, 37% of all people who moved into the city since 2010 moved into Center City or University City. So this is the growing area, it's the strong area, it's the post-industrial area, and that obviously is like dropping a rock in a pond in terms of residential patterns. But the Center City, and this gets to the core of our story, the Center City in 1963 was very small by current standards, fine to pine, and they didn't have a lot of confidence that it would succeed. So, all right, we've got this area called Center City. We need to serve it in the highway age with highways. And this is the 1963 view of serving Center City, linking it to the region with highways. That's I-95 in the foreground. You can see Vine Street on the right. You can see the Schuylkill Expressway in the left. And you can see the bad guy for tonight's forum, the Crosstown Expressway on the left. It was going to go river to river, essentially. And here's the central waterfront, obviously, as I-95 is getting built. That arrow is pointing to Front Street, just so you get a sense of what was between Front Street and the water. And that all gets cleared out beginning in the very early 60s when demolition begins for I-95. Lots of factories, loft buildings that today would be luxury condos were taken away, but hundreds of individual homes and significant displacement of lots of people living between Front Street and this significant area. So you had this whole process going on, and it obviously, this is from 1968, you can see already how it cut the neighborhood off from the waterfront. More significantly, it separated the city from the central waterfront in very major ways, and so we have this gigantic gap that we know only giants can cross over. And that has been obviously a significant challenge that the city is still wrestling with, and you're wrestling with right here. Can you improve the connections underneath I-95? But now we get to our story, because I-95 was just a piece of it, and it was going to directly connect with high-speed ramps, just like you can go from I-95 onto Vine Street, onto the Crosstown Expressway. And it was going to be river to river, along the South Street and Bainbridge, at one point Lombard, then South Street and Bainbridge, and there's the path of the highway. And it was part of a much broader network of highways, some of which were built, some of which were never built, but it was the age where we thought people would only move around by cars. So it was a huge commitment to building highways, and all right-of-way was achieved by condemnation. And you probably all know about condemnation, but Conrad delivered to us this letter, which I'm going to blow up in a second, but this was a letter sent from the Department of Transportation to Conrad's wife's parents. Grandparents, sorry. And I'm going to read this, but it's a remarkable letter. First, it's to inform you that the Department of Highways has decided... I'm blocking my own story, okay. All right, am I out of the way? Okay. All right, you can see they've decided to take your house by right-of-way. In a few weeks, somebody's going to come visit you. It's the third paragraph that's the really interesting paragraph. Please note that your property has not been condemned, and you are not required to move from the premises. When your removal is eventually required, you will be visited by the right-of-way agent who will explain your rights to relocation assistance and moving costs. I mean, today in the world of citizen participation, you can understand if you had been not born in this country and you get a letter like this from the government, it's like, oh my God, what can I do? And it's not even clear what this says. Am I leaving or not leaving, right? So it creates all this huge uncertainty, and that uncertainty had a chilling effect. Do I improve my property or do not? Do I go to the suburbs like everybody else, or can I stay here? And it had a huge effect on the commercial properties on the South Street corridor. These are investment properties now. Do I put more money into my business or not put more money? And that threat of the highway, from the time it was announced in the late 60s all the way up to the time in 72, created this uncertainty where there was not a lot of investment happening on South Street. Rick and Joel will talk about this as part of their story, because into that vacuum moved people who created the South Street Renaissance. So that, in some sense, set the stage. But the story really begins with the fact that a group of people finally said, we're not just going to roll over and play dead. And for the first time, a series of demonstrations. New York did the same thing. Jane Jacobs got her start protesting against the highway that was going to go right through Washington Square. Philadelphians started to do the same thing, a revolt against highways. And there were a series of organized protests, basically, where people started to, a basic sense of empowerment. You know, we don't have to take this, you can fight highways. And people were starting to say preserving neighborhoods is more important than enhancing mobility. That was the key message to all of this. What was most important about this, at a time in the history of this city where black and white neighborhoods didn't actually get along very well, this was a biracial coalition, and that is Alice Lipscomb at the head of the parade, and we'll talk about Alice in a moment. And John Coates and Eddie Williams will talk about her role and the role of other people who were part of this. But these were a group of people who came together to say, do not build the highway. They were brought together, and this was one of John Coates' really important role from the South Central Urban Renewal Pact, opening an office which brought neighborhoods who usually weren't talking to each other, who didn't trust each other, together in a coalition to stop the highway. So on the northern side, while Vine Street really cut through the northern edge, The fact that the crosstown wasn't built has created a totally different situation for us south of South Street. Instead of a highway, Alice Lipscomb got Lipscomb Square Apartments, affordable housing that has been built and has been maintained in the Hawthorne neighborhood. Instead of seeing buildings like this demolished, today they are housing and commercial. Instead of seeing Second and South as a highway ramp, we know it today as Bridget Foy's. Instead of seeing empty buildings demolished on Hancock Street, today there are attractive houses and apartments, and you could do this across the entire corridor. But South Street today, and for years it was just the east side, frankly the west side I think is doing better than the east side today in terms of thriving vitality, but river to river it is a thriving commercial corridor. We did this calculation. We went back and looked at the assessed value of all the real estate in the red area, which is the corridor that was going to be demolished for the Crosstown Expressway. And the real estate taxes paid in that corridor in 1972, the year the highway was stricken, was $353,000 a year. This next year, the tax bill due in that corridor is $17 million. If you ever want to know what happens if you don't build a highway, that represents $285 million in real estate taxes collected from an area where the highway was not built. So very simply, you've got this uninterrupted flow from Center City going into all of South Philadelphia, but you've got all these gaps along the northern edge, north of Chinatown, north of Vine Street. And what we call Center City or Greater Center City today, Girard to Tasker, River to River, is now the fastest growing residential section in the city. We're up to about 188,000 people, grown by 99%, and 25% of all people who moved into Center City in the last 6 years moved into just the downtown. So that's the story, and I want to ask John Coates and Eddie Williams, whose name I didn't put up here, I apologize, Rick Snyderman and Joel Spivak, Marge Schernecke from QVNA, and I think Conrad and David are going to bat cleanup or pinch hit, but why don't we come on up, and somebody else is going to be the timekeeper, but really to sort of tell the story of this then from the perspective of people who were here. So John, you're first, I think. John Coates. So I ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves in terms of what their role is. Because they're older than me and they remember this.
Hi, good evening. John Coates. I'm a retired city administrator, but during this time, I was the executive director of something called the South Central Project Area Committee. That was designed to coordinate the efforts in the corridor from river to river, Lombard to Washington Avenue. What we had then was a roughly 43,000 area of residents of diverse political, social, and economic values. We had Schuylkill, people in the Schuylkill area. We had the Southwest City Group, which Ed was part of. Alice Lipscomb had the Hawthorne Square, or the Hawthorne Community Council, and we had Bella Vista and Queen Village. I must say, this is one of my more friendly nights in Queen Village.
Just got started, though.
I always like coming to Queen Village on Monday night because the meetings got over early because of Monday Night Football. Still in all, the purpose of our being here tonight is to try to set a stage. Once this bombshell hit, especially on the west side where we had a lot of low income and poor black communities, they felt this was an immediate discriminatory effort. And Ed and people like George Dukes and Alice Lipscomb had a group called the Committee to Preserve and Develop the Crosstown Expressway, which later became part of the South Central Pact. While they were fighting the effects of displacement and lack of any development in that area, people in Queen Village were starting to realize that Society Hill was starting to encroach in their area. And that's when people like Conrad and Marge and Dave, Conrad spearheading a very strong zoning platform, which didn't necessarily deny development, but forced developers to come before the committee and tell them their plans and have to include a lot of the citizen input. So I know we only have 4 or 5 minutes to talk, but point I'd like to say, the takeaway here is that you had groups that had many, many different types of agendas, and while I juggled between all of them to try to keep the coalition together, the upside is there is no highway, development has happened, and here we are tonight, we're celebrating that. It didn't happen. Thank you.
If you don't mind, can everybody hear me? If you don't mind, I'll sit down because I'm slightly handicapped, not an invalid. And I say that all the time because people are trying to help me. You know, I say I'm a handicap and not an invalid, so a lot of time I need help. My name's Ed Williams, and I still live in the area. I live 21st and Cato. Lived in that block since 1946. My children lived there, my daughter lived next door, my son lived down the street. Happened to own those 3 properties. And I remember when George and I joined the Rittenhouse Community Council before it became SWIC. But our area from south to Washington Avenue didn't identify with Rittenhouse Square. So we changed the name to SWIC, Southwest Center City Citizens Council. And then we got involved with Alice, and one of the most thing that we had trying to pull our people together is because they didn't believe that that actually was going to be an expressway. They thought it was another trick in the black community. At that time, every time so-called white folks come up with an idea, it was some kind of trick for black folks. So we had a hard time trying to keep the people together, say, yeah, it is true. A highway is coming through. And so finally we were able to convince a lot of people. We asked them to make sure you hold on to your houses, don't sell. It was talking about relocation money and all that kind of stuff. But just stay here, you know. And so we had the marches like you seen on the film up there. And so we was finally able around the late 70s to defeat the so-called monster that everybody was, the coalition across from river to river was fighting, and we defeated it. So, but I run into some people now and say, we told you years ago that's what they were going to do, is what we moved us out and moved new people in. You know, so they kind of had something there, and we didn't. It took a while for me to believe that actually they were going to build a road, you know, until a lawyer by the name of Bob Sugarman.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, Bob Sugarman came on and worked with us pro bono, and he convinced us, yes, they're going to build a road, you know, and you know, the rest is history.
I would just like to kind of reiterate what Eddie said, because you know, Eddie, this community, Marge Schernecke, I grew up right there at 852 South Front Street, born and raised. Now I live at 846. But living here all our lives. And when I grew up here, I was told you can't fight City Hall. You can't, if they're going to build a highway there, that highway's going to be there. And eventually, when we got involved in Queen Village Neighbors Association, Kathy Conley and I worked for John, and we used to have to nag Eddie on Fridays to find out when we were going to get paid. But you know, one thing that I want to stress is this community was diverse, ethnically, racially, religiously, and what we had in common, I think, with all the other groups in the South Central Park was one goal: get rid of this highway. Nobody had a secret agenda or an ulterior motive. There were people from Bella Vista, there were people that lived on South Street in those days that were in favor of the highway. We weren't. We had already lived with 130 houses being taken from us that were historically certifiable for I-95. We didn't want another highway. So I think that's why one of the things that we had was one goal, we worked together pretty well at the end, and we became really good friends.
Why don't you pick up the sort of narrative, what brought you to South Street and the story from there?
Absolutely.
Well, I was actually born at 300 South 4th Street when it was not society. It was an ethnic neighborhood of people that couldn't wait to escape the Jewish ghetto. And that's what my parents did at some point. But the first 5 years of my life, I remember riding my tricycle down 4th Street to South. I remember my father telling me about stories about a tea room that was located between South and Bainbridge. Tea rooms in the 1930s, before Prohibition, were actually places where you could go and have a cup of tea, but it wasn't tea. Yes, it was tea. So it was a very kind of, a rough and tumble kind of place, South Street. And I remember the push carts on Passyunk Avenue and 4th Street and places like that. And so it was really interesting to kind of circle around after many years of growing up in West Oak Lane, and then coming back after I was in the service to live in Center City, and then eventually making my way to South Street again in the 1970s, early 1970s, late 1960s. But what was interesting about South Street at that time was, and this we're talking about the eastern end of South Street, because that's where the South Street Renaissance was that unlike many communities that we think of, and I was actually just speaking recently at Taller Puertorriqueños in North Philadelphia, many of these communities were ethnically based communities, perhaps of a particular religious denomination. So there were a lot of Polish people that lived in this area, and there were in other parts of the city neighborhoods that were of other ethnic groups. What came at that time was a very interesting, let's call it a post-war experience. A group of people came here because South Street was largely abandoned in the 1960s. And they were people who were from everywhere. So they were not an ethnic community. They were not a tight group of people that had shared some kind of particular heritage or background. They were people who shared something else, which was an interest in creative energy. Because this was the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and there were a lot of new forces that were changing the model of what urban life was all about. And South Street, for me, in retrospect, was that kind of experience. So what came out of that experience for us was a very different kind of one that would come to an ethnic community, which was that an ethnic community preserves its heritage and to some extent puts a wall around itself, perhaps like the Chinatown area, or in the case of the area around 5th and Lehigh, where Puertorriqueños is. This is an extraordinary neighborhood that's very tight in terms of what its history and ethnic background is, but it is a very identifiable place that looks more inward than outward. The South Street community began as a group of people that came from elsewhere, and their approach was completely the opposite. Their bond was about tolerance. So before there was an acceptance of gay in Philadelphia, there was South Street. Before there was an acceptance of people of all different kinds. I mean, I remember there was a crazy guy that used to walk down South Street every day, right in front of my door, and he would, as he would go by, say, "The sunny side of the street," and it was just, and that was his thing. And he never talked to anybody. He just went down the street and sang "The sunny side of the street." I mean, there were all these really, you would describe them as characters. And they were characters. There was Benny Dorfman. What comes up, goes up, must come down. And he would talk about the cockroach condominiums, which is what he called the housing in the neighborhood at the time. So there were all these people. We had a guy, Leo. Leo used to use our basement as his warehouse. Leo was this guy who was an Orthodox Jew, but he always had a dirty raincoat and a dirty fedora on, because of course he was an Orthodox Jew. And when people would be in my gallery, and Ruth's gallery and I, he would run in, go down to the basement, and somebody would say, "Did you see this guy just went down your basement?" Well, it was him. It was Leo, and he was storing his stuff in the basement. And Leo was one of these guys who would say, "Oh yeah, I grew up in Atlantic City. I used to live at the Underwood Hotel under the boardwalk." You know, he was. I mean, these are the kinds of people that all of us college-educated artists interacted with. And what was wonderful about it was that this was what South Street was about. It was about having those daily interactions. A guy named Harry, who was a salesman of linoleum, and we had a bench in front of our place, and Harry loved to make a little play with the girls who would come. Harry was a man in his 60s by this time, and he would pretend he would fall asleep, but then somebody would sit down on the other side of the bench and talk to their friend, and Harry would take out a piece of material that was like these false teeth that you would see for Halloween, and all of a sudden he would turn around and go, "Hello!" So there was a cup up in the air. I mean, these are priceless stories, you know, and this was what our kids grew up with. We raised our kids on South Street. Many people raised their kids on South Street. The point of the story was that South Street was a theater piece. And not surprisingly, it was because it began in 1965 with a repertory company of people from all over the country that started the Theater of the Living Arts. That included people like Morgan Freeman and Danny DeVito and Sally Kirkland, who all began their careers at 300 block of South Street as artists in the theater performance.
You're getting a signal. Why don't you do 2 minutes on just how the group came together and
So-
everything else, and then we'll come back to Q&A.
So the group came together because there was no possible way that we could have found ourselves in a neighborhood that was all splendid and well fixed up. But because of all these abandoned buildings, artists took advantage of that. So the ethnic community that was here used resources that they found available to them. And that's exactly what the South Street people did. They found resources as artists that were available to them. So there was an instant bonding with the old merchants that were here, who had come from that other world. And part of the story that we were telling was the skill that they didn't have, which was to be theater people. We were actors. We were actors on the stage of the city of Philadelphia, where we would stage parades and protests, and thousands of people would come to South Street, and we would then argue to the city officials and the state officials, how could you tear this down and build a highway? There's 25,000 people here for this festival today. And by the dint of our efforts, this little band of a couple of hundred people created the idea that there was like an army of people here that was making this place happen. And that was really part of the South Street story.
Great, we'll come back for Q&A.
Well, I'll give you a couple little stories. I'm a native Philadelphian, and in 1965 I was working for Frank Weiss, the architect, and we did the renovations for the TLA. And while we were doing the renovations, I thought, who in their right mind is going to come here? Because this is like the funkiest part of Philadelphia. In the meantime, after we did the job, I had restored a couple houses in Society Hill, and then I moved to Vermont. I wanted to live somewhere else other than Philadelphia. And I came back to visit my family in 1969, and I ran into Rick and Ruth. And they asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm on my way to Europe to do something. I had a very good career as an architect engineer. And they said, well, why don't you come to South Street? Ruthie wants to open another store. So I thought I'd be on South Street a couple of weeks. So I went down to South Street and I was building the store. While I was building the store, I ran into a friend of mine who was living at 324 South Street. They were paying $100 a month for the building. It had 4 apartments. And he says, I have an apartment for $25 a month. And at that time, I could make that in an afternoon at the architect's office. So I took the apartment thinking I'd be there a couple of weeks, and then
30 years later.
50 years later, actually, almost, still here. But an interesting thing related to the highway, and I really didn't even think about the highway or any of it, was one day my doorbell, a woman rang my doorbell, and she had a clipboard, and she came in and she said, I'm from the relocation service, and you're going to have to move. So I thought, okay, I don't know, I just got this cheap apartment. So she looked at the apartment, and she asked me how much rent I paid, and I said $25 a month, and she shook her head. She goes, how am I going to find you a place to live? Because technically, they had to move you to a comparable. So she said, we have another deal. There's a different deal. We buy you out. So I said, well, what's that deal? She says, we give you $200 cash, and we pay for you to move. And interestingly enough, a couple of years ago, I ran into some people who were on South Street. They took the buyout and moved to Fitzwater Street. So what happened was all of a sudden I became conscious of the fact that there was a highway threatening my beautiful life. I had built Lickety Split and the Black Banana around that time we were doing that. So I had built 2 of the greatest restaurants in Philadelphia. They didn't have any money to pay me. So I had food credit, which actually lasted until 1980. It was pretty amazing. They would not let me pay for my meal for their entire existence. Because the guy said if it wasn't for you, there wouldn't be a Lickety Split. So I decided I would get involved in the highway. I didn't know in what way, but I knew Alice Lipskin from somewhere before, and we were looking for things that we could present about the highway, that why you shouldn't tear the highway down.
Didn't Zimmer do that house?
Yeah, and I found right where Alice was, like right in the 1200 block, 1100 block, whatever, were the oldest occupied houses in the United States by African Americans. So there was some historic thing. Now we have historic things about the thing. And I got involved with the Polish women, which was Marge's mother and Kathy's mother. And one day they said to me, we want to have some kind of demonstration about the highway. And I said, well, look, I've been very active in the 60s. I'm a veteran against the war, and I'm not afraid to get arrested or whatever. I said, come on, we're going to make these things 1x2s and a sign. And we went to City Hall. So we're in the middle of City Hall. We're walking around the courtyard, you know, and had our signs. And we were like, you know, trying to get some attention. And I hear a marching band. So I walk out of the portal, south portal, and I see that there's a parade coming around City Hall with dignitaries and cars and all kinds of festivities. So I called all the Polish women and I said, come on, I said, after this band goes past, just about 50 feet to the next band, we're going in the streets. And they said, oh, are we allowed to do this? I said, well, what are they going to do? So we got in the street and we went around. As it came around City Hall, there was a grandstand and the mayor and the TV was there. And all of a sudden, these 8 or 10 Polish women and me were on TV with our big signs. So that's my 2 stories. I mean, I have a lot of those stories, but they're the basic interesting stories that were personal, that they actually came to make you move and would move you. Thank you.
I'm not handicapped either, I'm just fat. I just want to tell you, this was the 60s. There was civil disobedience. We learned from the Vietnam protests and everything else. One group, and I don't want to mention any names, but Don Fagan bought a car, and we took the car and we rode all over it, stopped at Crosstown, everything else. We drove it onto the tracks at 4th and Bainbridge and blocked traffic from 4th Street. South Street couldn't turn all the way around. We grabbed the keys and we ran. And that was our civil obedience. About the only thing that bothers me about that whole thing, that we did it, was I didn't keep that car. It was a 50-something or other. But there were a couple other incidents that happened, and I want to bring them up so we can then get a discussion going with everybody. One was the incident of the globada machine. And PennDOT set up some kind of machine that made cement 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was driving everybody in the neighborhood crazy. I mean, literally you could hear it. No sound barriers then. And everybody was complaining. We called PennDOT, everybody was complaining. One night, and I won't mention the name, somebody actually fired a shot with a rifle into the globada machine. And the police could trace it. They knew exactly where it went to, and everybody denied it. There were no witnesses, but they actually did fire a shot. And the next day, at 5 o'clock, they turned the machine off. Okay?
It wounded a PennDOT truck.
So there was also a councilman Greenberg, and he was a second-term councilman from the Northeast, and he started a whole campaign against Queen Village, that we are keeping his constituents from getting to the Spectrum and to see the flyers and everything, and he's bringing his people down to South Philly, to Queen Village, to drive around and protest stopping the I-95 ramps and everything else. So he's bringing his people down. He's going to show us what it's about. The night before he came down, somebody called the police. They found a rifle along the route that he was taking. He also never came down. That I don't regret at all, by the way. I thought that was really cool. But I must tell you real quick about Inspector Fensel and another incident when Marge called for a giant rally at 3rd and Lombard to protest Crosstown and everything else that was happening at the Crosstown. And about 6 people showed up. But civil disobedience with Inspector Fensel showed up. And they all came down and they look, and there's the 6 of us there. And Channel 6, or actually it was Channel 6 was down there. And looking around, and finally Fensel said, here's the deal. He had all his officers, they were wearing suits, they were civilian dressed, take off their armbands and take off their badges, and they took our signs and put them like this. There were more police than there were protesters. We walked around in a circle of probably about 6 feet. Like, it came off on Channel 6 like there were hundreds of people. And then literally, they took the pictures and everybody went home. That was it.
That was a theater piece.
Okay, I'm Conrad Weiler. I moved to Queen Village, I think, in '72, and then I was a lot of learning very quickly going on. I really saw a lot of change going on, and so I got involved. And I got involved in the tail end of the Crosstown, and now listening to Rick and Joe, I realized their artistic vision really helped to shape a lot of the protests. That's why they were so effective, because you could outthink, the normal way that the politicians and the establishment and the PennDOT people thought. And then people like Marge and my late mother-in-law, a lot of other people who really just were committed to the neighborhood. And then we also formed the coalition, so it was like learning all over the place. Interracial coalition, people from different ethnic backgrounds, class, income, they all were sort of united with this common goal. The only reason, I guess, why I have a claim to any fame is after the highway, the Crosstown was killed for the 3rd time. Then about 3 or 4 months later, lo and behold, they didn't take the ramps off of the plan to I-95. And they said, well, okay, well, the traffic will just go along your local roads. and so that was the start of the fight against the ramps, which I spent a lot of time doing. And that's, I guess, the final part. And there was a lot of creativity into that, a lot of good, we talked about, you showed the real estate value and the wonderful neighborhoods and Hawthorne Squares, but also as a result of the ramps, we got noise barriers. It was the first ones in Pennsylvania. I went out to Minnesota and took pictures and studied what they did out there for noise barriers. And I brought it back to PennDOT, and it was like, noise barriers, never heard of that. So it was really, I guess, a 15-year struggle. But it really took a lot of people opening their minds and cooperating, getting to know the politicians, getting to understand the plans and what the big deal was. Because it really was a change in the way we saw cities. From this top-down that Paul described as top-down, kind of almost Stalinist central planning of everything, to really more a people-up approach, and which hopefully is still going on in Queen Village and other neighborhoods. So I won't say anything else.
I got here in '76, and it was at the tail end of the I-95 off-ramps, and the stop the ramps button that David's wearing was over. But there had been need to there was money for sound barriers, and we went through this extensive process. We were meeting here on Front Street, and as Conrad said, PennDOT had never heard of sound barriers. Sound barriers were things you did in Minnesota and California, not in Pennsylvania. There was not a single sound barrier. We literally had 6 months of fighting and negotiation, which ultimately resulted in the park that's here along Front Street from what used to be Rick's place. What is it now? What's the rest? Canellas all the way on up. So we went through this whole process of designing those, and we stood behind someone's house on Front Street because it was going to be an 8-foot tall, a 10-foot tall, or a 12-foot tall sound barrier. So we actually stapled sheets onto wood, and we held them up behind people's houses. But you remember that? But
Yeah.
the punchline of all of this is somewhere about 1985. You remember these names, Harvey Knauer and Frank Sorrentino,
That's
who were the
right.
two engineers from PennDOT who were assigned to this project. And literally, after months of fighting with them, I get a call from Harvey saying, "I'm being given an award. Will you come and speak?" And it was what was then the Holiday Inn. And Harvey was given an award for creative engineering, designing sound barriers, and community partnership. I actually got up with a straight face and congratulated him. But it was a real rare moment that this guy was winning an award, and Harvey is still working as a consultant. He's in his
That's right.
mid-80s, and he is the expert from PennDOT today on sound barriers. I learned it here at Greenberg. Panelists did the amazing thing. They all kept within their time limits. Each of them has 10 more stories. So questions to any of them. And to any of them.
Identify yourself, Jeff.
Sorry,
Come on.
Jeff Ornstein, Community Village Neighborhood Association board member, friend of Marge's and Dave's and Rick's, and happy to meet everybody else tonight. I have a question. I guess Marge is probably the right person to answer this. So, as we now know, ILMAC controls this very shady organization, or very opaque organization, let's say, that controls the rights of way. Tell us that end piece of the story. How do we get to the point where ILMAC is
It was
created?
mandated. It was,
Oh, I know.
no, but
Believe
what
me.
I'm
She's a
saying
shady
is,
character.
I'm a shady
It's an
character.
opaque organization. I didn't mean shady.
No, ILMAC was mandated, okay, by a court order, okay, as part of the consent decree, I understand, okay? And it's set up as a nonprofit. We are a nonprofit organization. I represent Senator Farnese. I was appointed by Larry Farnese. I actually succeeded Jeff Rush, Kathy's husband here. When Jeff passed away, he appointed me, and Brian Donnelly is my alternate. And I sit with other members. The former president of Pensport is our chairman. He is James Moreland. What's his name? Andy Sackstetter is the treasurer. And they represent something called, I think, Jeff, are you still chairman of the Community Council for Interstate Land Management? The Community Coalition, I'm sorry, for Interstate Land Management, which has representatives of every part of the waterfront wards, okay, from bridge to bridge, sits on the Community Council. And, okay, okay, what we do is we are responsible for maintenance of all the land adjacent to 95 from bridge to bridge and what goes on underneath. So we are responsible for the leases, like our parking lot here in Queen Village. That money that is generated, I park under there, that money is generated, and the lease is held by Queen Village Neighbors Association, but a portion of that lease goes to the maintenance and management through ILMAC, as well as all of the land under I-95. Most of it is like the Goldbergs that have the development down there at Snyder Plaza. Any of that land under there that is leased for the movies, that goes to ILMAC. A portion of that goes to ILMAC for maintenance and management of the land under I-95. That's what we're responsible for. However, since I have the floor, I'd just like to say something. And that is, most of you know about the reconstruction of I-95 that's going to be coming down the pipe very soon in the next few years. You know what's happening up where the sugar house is? That's moving down here, okay? We're going to be disrupted. They're going to reconstruct because this highway is 50 years old and it needs to be rebuilt. It leaks, it has structural problems. But the thing that really bothers me is that $225 million are going into a 2-square block area for a park that the mayor proposes to put $225 million into, in the hopes of developing the waterfront, Penn's Landing. While those of us who live in the waterfront wards, all adjacent to the highway, okay, have had to do our own mitigation. I work with the Front Street, Friends of Front Street, I think Maria is still back there, Greenway Committee, and we have tried to raise money. I wrote a $50,000 grant to try to do some improvements over here on Front Street for a gateway. I know that Pensport wants some improvements. I believe Franklin Bridge North and Old City, we all need improvements. I would like to see a portion of that $225 million that the mayor wants to put into that 2 square block area. I would like to see a percentage of that go to each of the communities for mitigation, because we have been living with this highway for more than 40 years, okay? And we have been feeling the impact of it. I think we all could use some mitigation from this highway. More nostalgia.
Any questions, people, about the history of this area?
Well, I just want to point something out. It's just a slightly different subject, but I just realized I think we have about 5 former Queen Village presidents sitting here. Right. All right, and Jeff Hornstein, Alan Hunter, the Honorable Paul Levy, Conrad Weiler, and Marge Schernecke and Al Schernecke, because they do everything together. So, but seriously, it's like 5 or 6 people. For anybody that didn't know them, these were the people here, literally, Marge and Al and forward, who formed Queen Village. I'd also like to say that Conrad and I were both not only members of the zoning board, but we chaired the zoning board, which was unheard of, and I believe that you were the first civic person who chaired the zoning board, not a politician, and not a member of a large financially involved voting bloc. He was the first civic guy that was put in that position, and it's pretty exciting. So
All of us presidents are going to be raising money for our presidential libraries. Any question over here? Sure.
As you were coalition, was there any specific strategies you were able to, or did this happen where some factions were more radical and some were more able to engage in a different way, so that you were giving everybody a 1-2 punch in a nice way and maybe not a nice way?
For instance, Queen Village, you know what they were doing. Oddly enough, Bella Vista was a group that wanted no involvement in federal programs. They wanted the natural market to develop their community. But you also had a political machine going. You had folks down here, you had the Italian neighborhood, you had Alice Lipscomb pick up the phone and call anybody in City Hall, and you had west of Broad, and we also had a former councilman for Gray's Ferry, Fran Rafferty. He's deceased now. So not only did you have a political thrust, you had the diversity element where the groups could not be divided. They weren't divided on race or economics or what have you. So you had a formidable front, and you had several things going on at the same time, but as I said, the theme underneath was stop the highway. And as the artist, the highway had a depressing effect on South Street. And it depressed the values, the land values, which is why people like the Snydermans and whatever could come into South Street and take advantage of that. West of Broad, we're able to get a significant project going around 19th and South, a fairly substantial block of new construction where people could have buy a house and have a duplex or a triplex. I think Jeremy Alvarez over here was one of the planners when we were involved. Were you also measuring for the ramps and all that? But Jeremy
I'll tell you something, PennDOT actually made the wall, the retaining wall, on this, in front of what they call the dog park.
Yeah.
That retaining wall is designed to be removed.
Don't tell me.
Thank you. Thank you,
But at
Jerry.
any rate, you had all these various factions going, and that's why I think it worked. And
It
again,
sounds like you forced the process. but I-
well, you had to. The economics were happening at the same time. While South Street was developing, Alice Lipscomb's project up at 11th Street, which you really couldn't tell the difference between that and high-income housing. It was one of the first co-ops in the city that low-income people could get into. And we had 19th and South, and further up, Councilwoman Verna was very active in helping reestablish that triangle up there, which was a former horse trough. So you had development going, and after a while, it started to get too expensive. I think also Abbott's Dairy was, weren't they were in the path. So that, which is now, I guess, the apartment building, had a lot of different factors.
One thing that I would like to say about that too, I worked on South Street in those days before I went to work for South Central. And when Rick moved in, he was our neighbor there. I worked at Auerbach's Children's Store in the boys department. Rick would come around with Joel and other people, and they would go to the old businesses and say, listen, we're going to plant some trees. How about making a contribution? Or we're going to make a park over here. And it was astounding because the old neighbors couldn't believe what these young people were doing here. And they also taught us in the community, I mean, here I am, this, good Catholic girl, as Kathy always says, what we know about protesting. They taught us how to protest with a flare. They always got the press down. It was magical.
Well, Rick, before you just talk a little bit about you guys move into Sagars, just to give a little bit of the people coming in 68, 67, 68, who was there, just so people get a sense of that.
Well, we weren't the first people on South Street. The Zagars, who had the Ice Gallery, came in 1967 or 68. And we met them around that time and became very dear friends. And because Julia and Isaiah had a background in South America, they had been Peace Corps developers in Peru in the late 50s and 60s. So we conceived of the idea, before we even had a gallery on South Street, of doing what was like a Mercado Sabado, a weekend market. And the place we wanted to do that was Head House. Now, Society Hill Towers was just getting built at that time. It was not in anybody's idea so much to move back downtown in 1967 or 68. That wasn't such a hot idea as it might be today. So when we started the Head House Market in 1969, it ran every Friday and Saturday till midnight. And we deliberately structured it to have artists and ethnic foods and international food purveyors. The architect Richard Saul Werman, who eventually became the originator of the TED project, was the architect who designed that project for us. And little did we know that we were actually creating a visibility for what Center City could be, a vision of what it could be, in this very beautiful historic restoration that was Head House Square. So those weekend markets, which were like the bazaars of South America, were very much a factor in getting people to relook at Society Hill, something that hadn't happened up till that point. The story of the highway itself was actually a three-part story. The first part of it, which you just heard about from John, was led by community activists like Alice Lipscomb, who was an amazing woman, and George Dukes, who was the president of the Black Business Association of Western Broad Street. What was interesting about that was the time that it happened. The state was really kind of negligent in getting its act together to buy the necessary properties. You saw a presentation here earlier about the condemnation process. And unfortunately for the poor working people of the waterfront, who were mostly white working class people of the 1950s when I-95 got built, they didn't know that they could protest. That time hadn't arrived yet. By the 1960s, it absolutely had arrived. And it arrived in the presence of the rise of black consciousness and the civil rights movement in America. Sure. So in 1965, after the assassination of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, there were riots. Part of LA was burned to the ground. Much of Detroit was burned to the ground. There were fires along Columbia Avenue. And in that particular moment, the black community of Philadelphia was in rising up against this same kind of literal displacement of their lives. And at that point, the city, obviously, the leadership of the city, I think it was Jim Tate, the mayor, got very nervous about all of this. And they said, look, don't start any fires, let's talk. Let's have a conversation about all this. And so what came out of all that conversation was an agreement to create a commission to investigate whether there was actually a manifest need to build this southern link of what would have been the idea of this loop road, because ring roads were then very much in style around inner cities. So Line Street, Schuylkill Expressway, I-95, and South Street was going to be the final piece of the ring, the inner city ring. But what they did instead was they organized a commission led by then managing director, a guy named Fred Corletto. So it became known as the Corletto Commission. And they hired a firm based in Washington, a traffic study firm called Voorhees. And Voorhees did a study about whether or not there were enough cars that would traverse the southern end of this to make this economically viable. And the Voorhees people did their study, and guess what? They came back and said, we don't think this highway has any viability. Well, that caused a huge controversy, and the Corletto Commission took a vote, and I think by 1 or 2 votes, they voted to accept the report of the Voorhees Committee. So that was the end of the first Crosstown Expressway.
Right.
Little did we know that that wasn't done yet, because enter our dear leader, Frank Rizzo, and his managing director, was Hill Levinson, and I forget what Melcher,
But I think was the
Planning Commission. That's right. He was the head of the Planning Commission. Not by chance. He was also a major real estate developer, just by chance. And so somehow in that moment came the second highway battle, which was a thing called Southbridge, in which Bernie Meltzer proposed to put the highway underground for 30 blocks and build a series of 40-story apartment towers above it. Well, that lasted about a New York minute, that idea. And so that one went by the wayside. But little did we know, as you just heard a few moments ago, that the original ramps that were going to connect I-95 to South Bainbridge or wherever this highway was going to go were still on the plans. That was the third battle for the Crosstown Expressway. So that didn't begin until 1974, and that's when I organized a thing called the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition to stop the ramp, the badges Dave is wearing. And so I contacted all the community people from all the community groups, and one of the real supporters of that was a guy who later, unfortunately, had a jail term, Buddy Cianfrani, Anthony Cianfrani, state senator. And Anthony Cianfrani was a real community guy. And he went in at this tooth and nail with then State Representative Sam Rappaport. And the two of them worked with us to form this thing called the Neighborhood Preservation Coalition. And we raised money and we hired a lawyer named John Hunt. John Hunt did some research. And what did John Hunt learn? He learned that because all of the environmental codes for building highways were relatively new. I mean, that had begun in the 60s. So there were all these new requirements for environmental studies. And guess what? The state of Pennsylvania had been negligent in producing almost all of them. So now John Hunt discovered that there were highways all over the state of Pennsylvania that hadn't followed the federal guidelines, and those projects could be shut down. And he went to Jay Kasser, the head of the Transportation Department in Harrisburg, and he told them about this. And suddenly, there was a consent decree offered. Okay, we won't build the highway, we won't do anything with the ramp. We'll sign a consent decree, because if they hadn't done that, we would have gone before the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, and we would have spilled the beans on every highway, major highway project in Pennsylvania that didn't have its proper environmental credentials. And you can imagine what a hullabaloo that would have caused. So that was the end of the third and final battle to stop the Crosstown Expressway.
Just to say one thing. Now you know why in meetings, and we had to write a letter, I'd say, get Rick to do it, get Rick to do it. That was the best summation I've ever heard.
Go ahead, please.
I just wanted to actually bring the conversation forward to what we're seeing now. Is Philadelphia is a city with a lot of growth and a lot of renewal, and you all very successfully were able to organize your activities with, communities in the neighborhood, but also bringing in professionals. You're talking a lot about people who have a lot of knowledge about how city government works. And so I wonder now, when people maybe, as we're growing, the neighborhood dynamic is very different. There are a lot of, I think the number one group demographic is millennials who don't know their neighbors in the same way. But we still have this need and desire for people to build these really robust communities. So I wonder, based on what your experiences have been, what lessons would you offer to people now?
Let me offer a not so good answer, which is very easy to organize people against something.
Yeah.
Seriously, what brought people together who didn't agree with each other was they all had the same enemy. And I'll just say our experience with the park here was we really tried to move from we're organized against something to be organized in favor of something. I remember when I was president of Queen Village Neighbors, I suggested that we declare war on Camden, just so we could have a common enemy. I'm being serious, because it is easy, not easy, this was a very hard task, but it's easier when everybody shares a common enemy. The harder thing is when things aren't life-threatening, to get people organized around something positive. I don't know, which one do you want to jump in?
And I don't know if Amy is still here. Is Amy here? Amy Grant. Hi, Amy. I think that's one of the reasons Amy has, and Jim has organized a forum like this, so that we're able to tell a lot of the newer residents who are unfamiliar with things in the community that perhaps they take for granted. That how hard we work to accomplish some of the things that we've accomplished to make, Queen Village the wonderful place that it is to live, work, and raise your families.
But there are projects, look at Jeff and others, there are projects going on in this neighborhood now, whether it is the whole extension of the historic markets and to improve 2nd Street, projects here at Shaw Tower Playground. Those are harder to organize people around, but they're frankly as necessary, if not more necessary today, to keep these neighborhoods alive. Other questions from people?
I don't have a question, but I know Joel would remember this too, but...
Ruth, why don't you just identify yourself so people know who you are?
Ruth Snyderman.
The other half of the I was going to Snyderman. Right.
We fought Rizzo for so many years. And at the end of that time, he gave us a plaque for community development.
He honored the South Street community for the wonderful thing that we did. It actually had furthered a lot of the cause of the bicentennial. Because what happened was, one of the reasons we had to create the name South Street Renaissance was not only because of the highway, but all of the maps in Philadelphia, downtown maps in Philadelphia, you went to a hotel or a phone book, they all ended in Lombard Street.
That's right.
Because they didn't want South Street on the map. Well, we realized when opening these restaurants and shops and everything along South Street, we really wanted the people who were going to be coming to Philadelphia for the bicentennial to know where we were. And amazingly enough, I guess you could say short-sighted thinking of Society Hill is they zoned out every commercial corner, which Philadelphia has corner stores. So basically, Society Hill did not have one. You couldn't go to the bathroom in Society Hill for a 10-block radius. And they had an experiment called Old City Sunday, I think in 1964. And all of the activity, anybody that came to Philadelphia for that event to go to see the Liberty Bell or anywhere in Society Hill, they all ended up on South Street. And that was like the first big boost of people learning about the businesses on South Street. So that all happened because of Rick and a bunch of people formed this thing, and we went and we lobbied the city to relocate the map to show South Street.
Go ahead, sure.
Yeah, I'd like to offer a comment on the decrease in community participation. This is the thing about it. I will blame it on the age of convenience. Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and a couple others, I'll say this bad, they're colonizing our brains. They're stealing our thinking. We'll make select what we're eating, what we're buying, and what we're, how we communicate with each other. And this is stealing away from the commons, the communities, and into the individual. And it's relentless. It's going to be more and more like this, and it's affecting already the younger generation.
I just want to say one thing about the neighborhood building, and that is Queen Village right now, or members of the community, have done an awesome job in Meredith, and Nevinger schools. They are known citywide. They actually probably have raised the real estate values $100,000 a house if you're in the Meredith catchment district, and Nevinger's catching up just as fast over there. So that's something that everybody can get around, and maybe look at Furness High School down on 2nd Street and bring that into the fold so we can keep all these wonderful young families in the community and grow all the way up. That's the big challenge. We have everybody in the neighborhood. My wife literally had to walk in the street today because there were so many kids going to school at 8 o'clock, 8:15 in the morning, you know, with the 1.5 and the bigger one. And she realized that all of them, you know, they're going to start moving out to the suburbs soon to go to school. If we could continue on the way Meredith was developed, this would just be the most explosive neighborhood in the history.
Yeah, follow up on that.
Yeah,
Just to follow up
sorry.
on that. What Dave's saying is right, because if you look west of Broad at the Arthur School, the Greenfield School, those schools at one point were not the most desirable. And I live up there and know. Now you can see the same type of thing. With the new families moving in, the preponderance of the better incomes and what have you, these schools have been forced to get their game back on track. And the same thing's happening. It's a result of all this.
Well, I just wanted to connect a couple things. So Marge mentioned Ilmac and the parking lot that Queen Village Neighbors controls. It generates revenue that we use to invest in our schools. And lots of neighborhoods are doing this. So in response to what you're saying, I think actually there's a huge amount of activism going on across the city by families who are going into their neighborhood schools and saying, you know, we're not going to let Harrisburg, which has starved our schools for decades in Philadelphia, we're not going to let Harrisburg decide whether we have good neighborhood schools. So neighbors are organizing around their schools. Amazing stuff going on at Nevinger in particular. You know, people are, and I'll say it like it is, middle-class white people are now starting to send their kids to these schools that they didn't before. And that's a good thing because we don't have socioeconomically integrated schools. The district is going to fold. But so there's this trend that's going on in probably 30 neighborhoods. I'm the chair of the Crosstown Coalition. We stole your name, which is a citywide organization of all the civic associations, and we all learn from each other. So Queen Village has, you know, this amazing history of struggle and building a neighborhood from the ground up, and that's happening all over the city right now. So from my point of view, this is a very exciting time, and millennial energy, and I'm not one, is pretty important, and they're getting involved all over the place. So what I say to young people is just do something. Right? Every neighborhood has a problem, figure out how to solve it, go to your civic association, go to your ward, whatever that organization is, get organized and do it. These people showed us the path, but we're still treading that same path.
Grant Paul of them has good work ethic. Great, thank you.
And thank Paul for putting the presentation together.